Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
He was known as the Bellflower Bomber. Whether he nailed you with a right or left, you could be sure it was going to be a powerful punch. He faced the likes of Ali, Frazier, and Norton. He fought for the heavyweight championship on 4 occasions, but unfortunately, he never grabbed hold of the belt. Yet, he was once named the most popular boxer in the land. And next, on Sports Forgotten Heroes, we're going to take a look at his fabulous career in the squared circle. We're talking Jerry Quarry.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Sports Forgotten Heroes. And as I do on occasion, it's time to step away from the action on the gridiron, the diamond, the ice, and the court. And time to step into the ring and talk about one of boxing's forgotten heroes, Jerry Quarry. First, the name, the Bellflower Bomber. It's really quite simple. Bellflower is the name of a small city in California near where Quarry based his camp. Quarry was born in Bakersfield, California, and his father was a boxer. In fact, his father loved the sport so much he had Jerry boxing by the time he was 5. That's right, just 5 years old. Not only that, Jerry had 2 brothers, Mike and Bobby, who also boxed. However, and sadly, none ever won a world championship. Jerry came closest. In fact, Jerry was an outstanding amateur boxer and won the 1965 Golden Gloves National Championship as a heavyweight when he was just 19. Jerry, who was much lighter than most heavyweight boxers, was at a distinct disadvantage. You see, at the time, boxing didn't have a cruiserweight division, and that's really where Jerry should have been. He was just too light. He was routinely giving away 20 and 30 pounds a fight. That's just too much. But still, he won. His overall professional record was 53 wins, 9 losses, and 4 ties. And if you eliminate his last fight at the age of 46 when he had nothing left, and he lost to Ron Cranmer, and just consider the rest of his career, it was pretty phenomenal. Excluding Cranmer, he only lost to Muhammad Ali twice, Joe Frazier twice, and once each to Ken Norton, George Teofilo, Jimmy Ellis, and Eddie Machin. While he also defeated the likes of Ron Lyle, Ernie Shavers, Floyd Patterson, and Buster Mathis. That's a pretty darn good career. 4 times Jerry Quarry fought for a heavyweight belt. He was the only boxer who had the guts to step into the ring with Ali after Ali had been exiled from boxing for draft dodging. And Quarry's 1969 heavyweight title bout against Joe Frazier was named by The Ring magazine as the fight of the year. But despite a powerful right and a powerful left, Quarry was just too light. He also cut easy. And those two factors, probably more than anything else, prevented Quarry from reaching his goal of winning the World Heavyweight Championship. But man, did he try. On today's show, I welcome back Tom Clark for a talk about Jerry Quarry. This will be Tom's third appearance on Sports Forgotten Heroes. He was my guest previously for conversations about Teofilo Stevenson and Archie Moore. If you haven't had a chance yet, please check out Tom's book, Death in the Ring. It's really a fun read, despite the title about boxing. Now, before we get to Tom, I have a favor to ask. Please check out the website, sportsfh.com, and let me know how I'm doing. Drop me a line there. And please check out everything the site has to offer. And if you have an idea for a show, let me know. Also, please follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on Twitter at SportsFHeroes. I'm trying to build as many followers as I can and would love to have you follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on Twitter at SportsFHeroes. If you haven't done so yet, please visit on Twitter and click follow. You can also follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on Instagram and look for the Sports Forgotten Heroes page on Facebook. As always, if you listen on Apple Podcasts, a 5-star rating would be much appreciated. All right, back to Jerry Quarry. He was as tough as they came. His biggest win came against Ernie Shavers, whom he upset and knocked out in the first round. In fact, Shavers' promoter, Don King, was so stunned and disappointed in Shavers that he reportedly tore up Ernie's contract right there in the ring following the knockout. But as Tom will tell us, while that was the highlight of Jerry's career, and while Jerry dished out a ton of punishment over his 18-plus years in the ring, he also took a lot of punishment, and this, sadly, led to a very premature death. And here to tell us all about the life and career of Jerry Quarry is Tom Clark. Tom, welcome back to Sports Forgotten Heroes.
Thank you, Warren. It's great to be here. This is my third trip. The first time I think I talked to you about Teofilo Stevenson, the great Cuban heavyweight amateur champion with world-class skills. And the last time was about Archie Moore, the knockout champion.
Correct. And this time, Jerry Quarry. And, like you said, we've done a few podcasts together. And the first being about Stevenson. And, you've written about boxing and are obviously a big fan of the sport. So let's begin today's podcast with a few general questions about boxing. Where does your interest in the sport come from?
Well, I think going back to the very early 1960s when I became a sports fan, when I was old enough to become a sports fan and a knowledgeable sports fan, that happened to be at the time that Muhammad Ali, then known as Cassius Clay, was starting to predict that he was going to knock out people in certain rounds. And in the early days, more often than not, he did deliver with these predicted knockouts. So he was such a charismatic figure and such a brilliant boxer that I think that got me into it. And of course, there was the good and evil aspect. There was Sonny Liston, who had just knocked out Floyd Patterson. I attended that fight on the closed circuit telecast. I was a kid in Sacramento, California. And that fight didn't last long. Neither did the rematch, which I didn't see in closed circuit, but I saw the first one. And so anyway, during that time, it was just a very exciting time with Ali, or Clay as he was then known, and Liston. And Patterson though an undersized heavyweight, was in a lot of ways a national hero because he was such a good guy. And then the terrible Sonny, as he was perceived, I'm not saying he was necessarily terrible. He certainly spent a lot of time in prison. Then he knocked out Floyd, not once, but twice in the first round. Then Ali beat Liston. So, and then not long after that, Joe Frazier became a factor. And it was really the golden era of heavyweight, say, from that point through the 80s, really, with Frazier and Foreman and George Foreman, Big George Foreman, 68 heavyweight champion. I think the greatest all-around knockout puncher in history.
Interesting.
And Ken Norton, and then into the late 70s and 80s, you have Larry Holmes. And then a little further on, you get Mike Tyson. So it was a very exciting time. I will have to say, though, if I assume you've read my piece on Jerry Quarry.
I have.
That ends my book, Death in the Ring. I have great respect for boxers. In fact, I attended a closed circuit cast, or now it's a pay-per-view at a local restaurant here in Bakersfield, California. Andy Ruiz, the first Mexican-American heavyweight champion in history, versus Anthony Joshua, who regained his title by outpointing Andy Ruiz. So it's not that I'm no longer a fan. It's just that I just don't watch as much because of seeing guys get either severely damaged and dying long, slow deaths, or sometimes not so slow deaths. And I think the guy that we're going to talk about later, Jerry Quarry, as well as his brother Mike, former heavyweight top contender and light heavyweight top contender, respectively. I think seeing that as I've gotten older, I think young men, with all that testosterone, are ready to just scream and say, kill him and all that. But, I've had to temper that kind of tendency with the very real suffering that has taken place.
At what point did boxing become so fascinating to you that you decided to write about it?
Well, as far as the writing aspect, that started taking place in the, I would say, the mid-'70s when I was in my early 20s. And so, in fact, I got an email just last week from a friend who said, "Hey, you should be writing about boxing more," and because I don't write about it regularly, I probably haven't written a boxing piece that I can think of, at least not many, since the one that I linked to you about Bobby Quarry, the youngest and only surviving member of the boxing Quarry family. So anyway, this weekend, I'm going to set aside some time and write about the Anthony Joshua fight, regaining his heavyweight title against Andy Ruiz. So I started in my early 20s, and off and on I've been writing about it since. But I write more about politics, but I'm going to get away from politics. I'm tired of politics.
That's sort of a boxing ring in and of itself these days.
Yes.
You and I have talked about UFC as well and how it's really become so much bigger than boxing today. Why do you think, though, that boxing has been unable to recapture that fancy of the fight fan, and how much of that do you think can be attributed to the fact that we just don't have the very dynamic personalities in the sport, like an Ali, a Frazier, a Foreman, a Leonard, a Hagler, guys like that?
Well, that's a factor. We have some very talented people in the game, but Ali was not only a once in a decade or a once in a generation star. He was really a once in a century star, and not only in boxing but in just in life. I mean, he was it's often said that people are larger than life. Well, in Ali's case, there was a guy larger than life, And Sonny Liston, for all his menace, he had a huge star quality. So did Joe Frazier. So did George Foreman. And so did Mike Tyson. Larry Holmes was a great fighter. He didn't quite have their star quality. He was as competitive with them athletically. But the guys that I just mentioned did have that transcendent quality, and so did Hagler, so did Leonard, and so did Roberto Duran. And I just don't think we have anyone with that star quality now. And you combine that with the Mayweather has it, but he really didn't have any serious rivals. Nor was he a dangerous knockout puncher by the standards of all the guys I've just listed. Also, I think people have very serious concerns about the damage that these boxers suffer. It's just something that's been much more publicized and much more studied scientifically than it was, say, when I was a kid. And I mean, we all knew the boxing was bad for you. People died. A guy named Davey Moore was killed by Sugar Ramos in an early 1960s fight in the Coliseum. An even more infamous fight, Benny Kid Perrette, who had made a sexual comment about the great Emil Griffith. And Griffith told him he was going to kill him, and I don't know if he was speaking literally, but he literally did that in a fight, still an infamous fight. So I think these kinds of things, people say, hey, in a world of football, which itself causes a lot of head injuries, but in a world of football, basketball, baseball, and so forth, and as well as all the movies and the video games and Netflix. I was watching Netflix last night, a Michael Douglas star miniseries. So I think that that it's the realization that it really destroys people, and that and that there are other sports out there. I think that's sort of, and as you've indicated, a lack of these transcendent personalities like an Ali, like a Foreman, a Frazier, or a Tyson, or a Roberto Duran, and Sugar Ray Leonard.
So Jerry Quarry, he was a heck of a fighter. Unfortunately, he didn't win the heavyweight championship of the world. But give us your overall impression of him, and what can you remember about him from watching him fight?
Well, he was very talented. He was about 6 feet and roughly 195 in his prime. In other words, he was way outgunned in terms of size, height, and weight in particular. And today, see, that's another thing about boxing. It's just primitive in a lot of ways. A fighter in the old days could only, if he was more than 175, he had to fight as a heavyweight. We now have the cruiserweight division, which initially only went up to 190, and now for a time it's gone up to 200. So there was no real good place for guys like Quarry and Floyd Patterson, for example. Those are two guys who were overpowered, say, by Ali, and they just weren't big enough. So that was Quarry's problem, being born at the wrong time. Also, as I talk about in my story, Jerry Quarry from Boxing Heaven, I'm thinking, what would Jerry think? He's in the cemetery not far from where I am now. I'm in Bakersfield, which is 110 miles north of LA, about 20 miles northwest of here in Shafter. He's in the cemetery, and I thought, what would he be thinking if he knew that his younger brother, Mike, former number one light heavyweight contender, is being buried here with me forever. And
it's funny you bring that up, because I have a question here for you about your book, Death in the Ring, and how you take such a unique approach to telling Jerry's story from his grave. So,
yes.
So I want you to continue along your thought, but I also want you to tell us how you arrived at that idea to tell it from the grave as if he was welcoming his brother home.
Well, yeah, he was, of course, there's an undercurrent of sadness all along, talking about his own demise as well as that of his young brother, Mike. But I began writing from the first person of other characters in the early 1980s when I started my first book, which was a biographical novel that's called Hitler Here. And I started writing from the point of view of people like Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, Eva Braun, General Patton, and so forth. All the characters have bylines. And so I just got in the habit at that stage, and that's been more than 35 years now that I actually started that, 36 years. And so what I did in that book, and I've done it subsequently, I thought just because someone dies doesn't mean you have to quit writing what they're thinking. It's at that point simply a matter of what would they be thinking.
Interesting.
And so that's how I did it with Jerry. And in rereading it today, I felt like I hadn't even written it; someone else had, because I felt I was like communicating with Jerry, Quarry.
Talk about
who, by the way, died at age 53 from dementia pugilistica.
Right.
And Mike would die a few years later in his mid-50s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're going to get into that. We're going to get into all of that. Talk about Jerry's upbringing. I mean, he came from a family of boxers, beginning with his dad. All of Jerry's brothers were boxers too, as you've been mentioning.
Well, yeah, there were 4 brothers and I think 4 sisters. One of the brothers supposedly knocked out Jerry when they were kids. He was a year or so older than Jerry, so a year can be a big difference at that stage. And that was a brother who, for a time, cared for Jerry when in his final days. Although the other family stepped in and cared for him, there was some bad blood in the family between this brother and the others, and that was Jimmy Quarry. But their father was not a professional fighter, but he was the guy who threw them into the ring when they were children, and I'm talking 5, 6 years old, and telling them there's no quit in a quarry. So they started off as, kindergarten, first graders, and winging it and told, hey, you can't quit. If you're a quarry, you can't quit. And so these guys started to learn very significant skills in boxing very early on. And also, let's face it, they started getting hit in the head early in life as well.
Was it a tough upbringing? I mean, was her father not a nice guy, or is this all he?
Yeah,
knew?
he was he was what we call 1940. Well, Jerry was born in 1944, I think it was, and maybe it was 45, and. So, a guy, meaning the father was probably born in around 1920 or something. So he was raised during the Depression, the World War II era, and he was a blue-collar guy, a guy from some poverty, and they lived in the hardscrabble area of Shafter, northwest here of Bakersfield. Jerry was known as the Bellflower Bomber, Bellflower being a suburb of L.A. south of town. But they were born here. And then they moved to Southern California. Mm-hmm. So everything was rough about it. A rough blue-collar father from the Depression, and then the kids brawling from early on. And particularly in the case of Jerry, they had a great natural toughness. Jerry had excellent knockout power. As an amateur, U.S. Amateur Championships one year, he knocked out 5 straight guys, which had never been done. It may never have been equal since then.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, he won his first championship when he was just 8 years old. I mean, that's crazy to think about. I didn't even know you could box in in an organization and organized boxing at the age of 8. I mean, it's a junior amateur championship. It's crazy.
Yeah, well, I think it is crazy good, but also crazy worrisome as well, because historically, fighters have come from poverty or certainly lower middle class backgrounds. You don't see too many sons of doctors and lawyers and entrepreneurs who have their kids, taking part in amateur boxing. It's just too brutal. but they started early and developed early. Mike had his first title shot. It may have been his only title shot. It was against Bob Foster, who was one of the most murderous punchers in the history of the light heavyweight division. He was 6'4", and usually a guy 6'4" is not going to only weigh 175, but he was just one of those long, lean guys who had great strength, and he had a devastating left hook. And they boxed around in the early rounds, and then Mike came in, and Bob Foster, so I phrased it in the story, in a career of great left hooks, unleashed perhaps his best, and right on the button. And Mike was completely unconscious for several minutes. And this was on a card in the summer of 1972. I remember very well. I saw it in Fresno. I was visiting my stepbrother there. And it was called the Quarry Brothers versus the Soul Brothers. And then in the nightcap, Jerry was having his second fight with Muhammad Ali. And it was a memorable evening. But the Quarry Brothers really had a tough evening, and particularly Mike, who was just, he was, like Jerry said, that scared me. Because, I mean, he was stiff, Mike, that being Mike. And so anyway, so he was precocious, and Jerry was precocious too. By the time he was in his early 20s, he was getting title fights. And his first title fight was in a tournament. He beat Floyd Patterson.
Right. But before we go there, let's go back a little. We're jumping a little ahead, and you had sort of you touched upon this. His first big title came in the 1965 National Golden Gloves Championships, and he won the tournament by knocking out each of his 5 opponents. Amazingly, that had never been done before, and as far as I can tell, as you had said, it's never been done since. Can you talk at all about those championships, the 65 National Golden Gloves, and just how dominant a fighter Jerry Quarry was?
Well, I think just as I had mentioned and you reiterated there, the fact that he knocked out 5 in a row, because in the amateurs, they're using big gloves and they're using headgear. And plus the guys are younger and, for the most part, not nearly as strong as they're going to get later on. So that really got a lot of attention when he did that. And not so much in a national sense, but within the boxing community. And then he developed rapidly as a pro. And he was a good-looking guy who was witty, and he could punch with power. And he was white. And he had all those things going for him, and that attracted a lot of attention. And he was known as Irish Jerry Quarry.
And I think one of the more amazing notes about that Golden Gloves championship as well is the fact that, at least what I have read, is that he had nephritis prior to that tournament, and he had to overcome nephritis in order to compete. And not only did he compete, he competed at a championship level. So I don't know a whole lot about nephritis and all of its, afflictions on a body, especially at such a young age. Do you know anything about that and how serious the condition was?
No, I really don't. I will confess to you that I don't know I don't know what nephritis is.
Oh, it affects the kidneys somehow.
Oh, I see. Yeah, well, that probably was his body telling him, Jerry, getting hit in the head as well as the kidneys and the liver is not good. And that would be, a possibility. Of course, even kids get sick. So, as I mentioned, the brain doesn't understand the difference. You can be a child. If you're getting hit in the head, sparring with your brother in the living room or the backyard, it's going to hurt you blow by blow, just as much as it does if you're fighting for the heavyweight championship of the world against, great fighters. And so I think the tale of the Quarries really begins then, the Quarry brothers, the 3 of them who became fighters, Bobby Quarry being the third, Jimmy the oldest, who did not pursue a professional career. He did some managing and training. And that's when they started gaining skills, confidence, determination, but also that's when they started really suffering brain damage as well.
Mm-hmm. So the Golden Gloves of 65, and shortly thereafter, Jerry turned pro, and by 1967, we're going to have a little fun here, he found himself in a position to win the heavyweight championship by virtue of a tournament that was put on by the WBA to crown a champion in the wake of its stripping Muhammad Ali. So let's talk about that for a moment. Let's test, give us your knowledge here. First, remind us why the WBA stripped Ali of his title.
Well, back in 1967, at the height of the Vietnam War, Muhammad Ali, he had changed his name, I think, after his first victory over Sonny Liston, which was in 1964. And he became a political activist and a civil rights leader in his own right. This was the era of Martin Luther King, as well. Malcolm X had been executed or assassinated in 1965. And Ali, I think very bravely and still correctly, is certainly on the right side of history, said, hey, no Vietnam's ever called me the N-word. I'm not going over there and fight. Why should I? Mm-hmm. And he said, I am a man of peace. I'm a religious man, which he certainly was. And so when it came time to step forward at the induction, Ali refused to do so. And the white power structure at that time thought, we got to make an example of this very charismatic, uppity black guy. And he was basically framed, and he took the right position, didn't want to go over there and slaughter what proved to be 2 million Southeast Asians, not only in Vietnam, but throughout the region. And so it's to his everlasting credit that he took that position, but it did cost him 3.5 years of his prime. Ultimately, I believe it was the Supreme Court that said we're not going to hear this case, or they said, okay, you can go. In other words, it never really went to trial, I don't think. Mm-hmm. Other than, did it go to trial initially? I think he was banned.
I think there was a trial, and I'll have to look it up. I believe there was a trial because he actually, he was banned. There was a trial.
Well, I think that was the athletic commissions that banned him. Right. And there may have been a trial initially.
But he didn't serve time.
No, he didn't serve any time. He was out on appeal 3.5 years later. People saw what a disaster the Vietnam War was. And he was just given, he was said, okay, you can resume your career. And coincidentally, he resumed his career in 1970 against Jerry Quarry.
But before that, we had to go to a tournament.
Oh, the tournament.
That's right. Absolutely. So Ali is stripped, and the WBA goes out and it ranks its top 8 fighters for the tournament, and Jerry was not one of those. However, Joe Frazier was ranked as one of those 8 fighters for the tournament, and he decided not to box. Do you know why?
No, I really don't. I imagine Joe was holding himself apart from that and otherwise above that fray because of he knew that he was the best heavyweight in the world.
Right.
This side of Ali. In fact, he considered himself better than Ali. And just getting ahead briefly, in 1971, he would prove, at least for the time, that time he was better than Ali as he was in their first fight.
And that was one heck of a fight in 71.
That's one of the greatest fights in history.
Yeah. So Frazier gets this separate title. He's a champion. They create a title for Joe Frazier. And now Quarry is included, and he didn't disappoint in that tournament. Tell us about Quarry, how he did. I mean, he beat Floyd Patterson.
Well, he first of all beat a former two-time heavyweight champion, Floyd Patterson, who, like Jerry, was undersized. He decisioned him. Then he knocked out a contender, Thad Spencer, and then he had a very close fight, majority decision loss against Jimmy Ellis, who was a childhood friend and sparring partner of Muhammad Ali in
and I think Ali and I think Ali actually managed or trained Ellis in that tournament.
Well, they probably worked out together. Sure, Ali had plenty of time and he wanted to stay in shape. They were friends, and Ellis was a fine fighter. Like Quarry and Patterson, he was undersized for a heavyweight. But he was, a good fighter. So that was a close fight, and my review indicates that it's two votes for Ellis and one was a draw. So I'm guessing that Jerry probably did lose that one in a close fashion, but he came that close to having a share of the heavyweight title.
Right. What was his style? Talk about his style and what was the knock against him? I mean, you talked about it. He was just under 6 foot, just under 200 pounds. He couldn't fight in the lighter division because there really wasn't a lighter division. There wasn't a cruiserweight division at that time. And his reach was just under 72 inches. So yeah, I guess size was one of the knocks against him, but there had to be other things. So what were his strengths and what were the knocks against him? Well,
his strengths were, he was a clever boxer. I mean, he could punch. He was a powerful puncher. He could hit hard with either hand. He knocked out, even though he fought excellent competition, he knocked out over half of his opponents fighting, includes the losses. Of the people he fought, he knocked out roughly 50% of them. So this is a guy who could hurt you with each hand. He knocked out, for example, Ernie Shavers in the first round. Ernie Shavers was one of the most feared fighters in history, devastating right hand. He also knocked out a guy named Mac Foster, who was 24-0 with 24 knockouts at the time. He beat Ron Lyle at a time that Ron Lyle was undefeated and considered a very likely heavyweight challenger. And so that's the kind of talent he has, beating those three guys as well as Floyd Patterson. So he could hit hard with either hand. He was a good counterpuncher, but he was a warrior. It's the no quit in the quarry thing. And having relatively short arms as well. If you're a short-armed heavyweight, chances are you're not going to be a defensive stylist like, say, the young Ali, or like if you, for those who saw the fight Saturday, Anthony Joshua at 6'6", who after getting knocked out by Andy Ruiz, totally rebuilt his style and was a jabber and a mover with an occasional right cross. But Jerry didn't have that option. Plus, I don't think constitutionally that was in him. He wanted to go to war. And so if he made a mistake, I would say that I don't know that there was a physical or athletic alternative, but he did engage in wars. I mean, Jerry Quarry came out there to go to war. He came out there to knock your head off. And given the quality and the size differences, he did, take some beatings. But he administered far more than he gave. But I would just say that he was outgunned in terms of size, even sometimes when he won. And some of the guys I mentioned, like Ernie Shavers, much bigger, Ron Lyle, much bigger, Mac Foster, much bigger. So he was fully capable of beating very good fighters who were bigger, but not great fighters who were bigger. How much
did the fact that Jerry cut easily affect his ability to maybe go the distance and win a championship fight?
Well, it's never good in the ring or in life or anywhere to get cut. But in the case of Jerry, I would say that when he was cut, it just seemed that it was when he was overmatched. It's in fights when he was overmatched. It wasn't as if Jerry was out dominating a fighter and then in the ninth round get cut and then lose the fight only for that reason. My recollection is that when he was busted up, whether it was specifically or cut, but just busted up. Ali busted him up twice. Frazier busted him up twice. Norton, it was a brutal beating back in the mid-'70s. And that's when, for the first time, Jerry Quarry retired, and he should have stayed retired. It was too late already, we know now, but it was, he just, it's a disadvantage to cut, but generally cutting for him was a result of being overmatched. I don't mean that he didn't have sensitive skin. I just mean that I don't recall it being a big factor in winning or losing. He was either being mauled or, which he did. And let's remember, this is a guy who won most of his fights.
Sure. Yep, he sure did. You know, it was really cool during my research where I found that he was ranked as the most popular fighter in the sport from 1968 through 1971. But before he was named the most popular fighter in boxing, or during the time he was named the most popular boxer in the sport, he continued to gain respect, and eventually he matched up with Joe Frazier. And that fight took place in June of 1969. And again, during my research, I found that the fight was called, or the first round of the fight was called the Round of the Decade, and the bout itself was named the Fight of the Year. Can you tell us anything about that fight, particularly the first round?
I have seen that and in recent years, and I've seen it a few times over the years. It's available on YouTube, or at least it was the last time I looked. And Jerry Quarry, again, this is a guy, remember, we said he's knocked out 5 straight amateur guys at the highest amateur level, so beat most of the people he fought as a pro. And up to that point, Jerry had not been stopped. And so he undoubtedly entered the ring that day in 1969 thinking, all right, I'm the baddest man on earth, and I'm going to go in there and kick the hell out of Joe Frazier. But what he learned and what he acknowledged many years later after he had retired, say, the first time, was that Joe Frazier was the toughest man he ever met. And he didn't know that during the first round, and he really picked Frazier apart. He got the advantage, but Joe Frazier was so powerful that it wasn't that Joe was in danger of going down or getting stopped, but still, it was a badass performance by Jerry Quarry, and so he took that first round. But after that, Frazier was by no means a big heavyweight, even by the standards of the day, but he had huge musculature and, as Quarry said, very tough, had perhaps the greatest left hook of all time, certainly one of them. And he really started busting up Jerry.
Two bulls going at each other.
They were going to fight again a couple of years later, and both fights ended in similar fashion for Jerry. Joe just overpowered him. Smoking Joe.
Sure, and that fight was stopped in the 7th round. And, again, here was one of these fights where Quarry was cut and they had to stop the fight. His fight after Joe was against a guy, and I hope I get his last name correct, George Teofilo. But Chuvalo. Okay, that fight had a very controversial ending. Can you talk about that? How? Well, yeah, go ahead.
It's probably available on YouTube. I haven't seen it. I read about it at the time. I've read about it since. It's my understanding that Jerry was outpointing Chuvalo, Now, Chuvalo was a big heavyweight. We should tell you a little bit about Chuvalo. Chuvalo twice went the distance with Muhammad Ali. He fought Frazier. He did not go the distance. Frazier busted him up so bad he had to quit. He busted I think his right cheek, maybe his jaw, something on the right side of his face, meaning that Frazier hit him with a left hook. And George Foreman also pounded Chuvalo into submission. But no one ever knocked George Chuvalo down. He was a very big and strong, tough Canadian. And anyway, Jerry fought him. Jerry was doing well. Late in the fight, it was probably a 10-round fight, 9th or 10th round. Do you have the round? Was it the 9th round?
I could look that up as we're talking about it.
Well, it was a late round. Chuvalo caught him, took him down, and Jerry says he was up in time. The referee said, and timer said otherwise. So it went in the books as a knockout for Chuvalo.
It was the 7th round.
7th round. Okay. Yeah. So anyway, George Chuvalo, very powerful Canadian, and big, strong guy, did take him out. Or when I say take him out, he put him down for the 10 count, but Jerry staggered up. But Jerry had, like a lot of fighters, even if they're cut badly or mauled or they're down for the 10 count, they get up and they say they want to continue. And maybe they really do. But I think it's very important for the referees and the judges and the medical people to stop these fights when they need to be stopped. And in boxing history, there is a tendency to let these fights go on too long. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I think that particular night, Chuvalo just caught him. But they were in the same general boat. They were very talented guys who were going against great fighters. Mm-hmm. I mentioned Foreman stopping Chuvalo, not knocking him down, but pounding him, as well as Frazier doing that, and Ali beating him twice. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of the same profile that Quarry had. Mm-hmm. Just really good, but going against some of the greatest who've ever lived.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was, like you said earlier, he might have been born at the wrong time. He had a very interesting relationship with Ali. Like we said earlier, he was in the tournament to fill Ali's vacant title in 1967. He faced Jimmy Ellis in the championship bout of that tournament, only to lose to Ellis, who was coached by Ali. Now it's 1970, and Ali has won the right to return to the ring, and no one wanted to fight him. Only one man stepped up, and that was Jerry Quarry. And from what I read, Ali didn't really show much appreciation to Quarry, did he?
Well, they were rivals. They were rivals, and Jerry still felt, this was 1970, and that was still early enough that Jerry had not, he hadn't totally learned that he wasn't going to be the best. He was really, really good, but he wasn't going to be the best heavyweight. And of course, Ali was madder than hell after being railroaded and losing 3.5 years of his prime, and for taking the right political stand. So. They both entered the ring very seriously, and Ali was just really sharp and busted up Quarry. In fact, I can remember there was I don't know if you're old enough to remember the comedy show from that era, Laugh-In.
Sure.
Roland Martin's Laugh-In with Goldie Hawn.
Yeah.
And they did a spoof on Quarry the weekend after the fight. And they had this guy all bandaged up, a comedian, and he's saying, "Oh, you shouldn't have stopped the fight. I'm fine," which was not to knock Quarry, but he did. The great Ali did show why we had missed such excellence in the ring during those 3.5 years. Mm-hmm. So Ali was going to handle Jerry not only that night, but a couple of years later.
Yeah, in 72, they fought again, and Ali won again. But this time, again, during my research, reading about Jerry Quarry, this time there were a lot of racial overtones, and I think this might have been when Quarry was given the nickname the Great White Hope. Can you talk about the circumstances?
Before, but, as I mentioned, that this matchup was known as the Quarry brothers versus the Soul brothers.
Right.
The Quarry brothers versus Ali, and then in the opening fight among the highlight card, it was Mike Quarry going again, totally outgunned against Bob Foster. So that's where, first of all, the title of the Quarry brothers versus the Soul brothers, it's a clever title. I don't think it necessarily is sensitive or appropriate, but that's what that night was all about. The poor Quarry brothers, for all their talent and toughness, were just really outgunned. I mean, Foster, just an absolute devastating puncher, a left hooker as a light heavyweight. And then, of course, Ali, I believe, still the greatest of all time. Mm-hmm. So they simply were outgunned.
Mm-hmm. After the Ali fight, the second Ali fight, I think it's widely recognized that Jerry went on to have the two best fights of his career. First, against Ron Lyle, as you had mentioned, an up-and-coming heavyweight. And Lyle was in line for a title bout, that is, until he met Jerry Quarry. Tell us about that fight.
Yeah, I thought, well, Jerry's really doesn't stand a chance against this Lyle. He's just too big and strong and tough and mean. He had come out of prison, kind of like Sonny Liston in that respect. And Ron Lyle was a hell of a fighter. In fact, Ron Lyle, back in early '76, was almost going to beat George Foreman. It's still, you can catch it on YouTube. I saw it live on TV, and man, I was growling. That's, as a young man, that kind of thing is very appealing. They were knocking each other down. I'm talking Foreman and Lyle. I say that to answer your question, saying Ron Lyle was a hell of a fighter, and Jerry just gave him a boxing lesson. And staggered him some, and he's won a decision. Mm-hmm. I think that fight was in Madison Square Garden. I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. And then next after that, you had mentioned it earlier as well, was Ernie Shavers, and Shavers was managed by Don King at that time. Tell us what Quarry did to Ernie Shavers.
Quarry, I mean, if you didn't know about that fight, and you just knew about their careers. I think you, meaning one would think, all right, no way Jerry survives long against this murderous right-hand bomber, Ernie Shavers. But in fact, Quarry started catching him with some combinations. No, I would say no more than a minute into the fight, and really just started landing many combinations. And Ernie Shavers, in fact, did not make it out of the first round. It was probably the single greatest victory of Jerry's career. I would rate that as the top victory, and either the Lyle or the Mac, probably the Lyle fight, the second best, and then Mac Foster's knockout, probably the third best, along with the Patterson victory. Those are probably the four greatest victories of his career.
Yeah, he beat Lyle in a unanimous decision with about 30 seconds to go in the fight in the 12th round. But he knocked out TKO. The ref stopped the fight, 2:20 into the first round, and Quarry had won. And Shavers was managed by Don King, as I said. King was so upset afterwards, he actually tore up Ernie Shavers' contract in the ring and went on to sign George Foreman. I mean, Don King wanted nothing to do at that point with Ernie Shavers. He couldn't believe that Quarry took care of him that quickly.
Well, that shows what a turncoat Don King was. I mean, a gifted promoter, certainly, but he should have had respect for the fact that boxing is an extremely difficult and dangerous business, and that Frazier did his best. He just got caught, and he just That was Jerry Quarry at his best. I mean, he was able to land multiple combinations, power shots, and just render Shavers incapable of continuing.
Mm-hmm. Now, like I said, this is when King signed George Foreman, or very shortly thereafter. So during his career, Jerry Quarry, as we said, fought a lot of great fighters, the best. He fought Frazier, he fought Ali, he fought Shavers, he fought Lyle, he fought Floyd Patterson. How come George Foreman never fought Jerry Quarry?
Well, George has turned in, for many years now, has been a congenial guy. He was known as kind of a surly fellow as a young man, whether it's true or not. That was his reputation. And he has said, though, in recent decades, "Oh, hey, I didn't want any part of Jerry Quarry." I believe they sparred after George won the gold medal in 1968 at the Mexico City Olympics. Perhaps in a more experienced Jerry, did quite well during the sparring session. Jerry undoubtedly felt he could win. But anyway, I just don't think that there was really the opportunity, because George won the title in 1973. I believe it was early 73. Lyndon Johnson had just died, I believe. So we're looking at around ballpark, let's say January of 73. And remember, George, for as great as he was not going to have that title that long, because there was a guy who hadn't had the title for 3.5 years in exile and had lost to Frazier, in his only title shot after coming back up to that point, and that was Ali. So really what it was all about after the first Frazier fight with Foreman was getting Ali back in the ring. With Foreman, the only problem was a guy named Kenny Norton beat Ali in the spring of 1973, and some think beat him again. That was in San Diego. There's a little personal history there. I was in San Diego, but I was visiting friends. I did not go to the fight. I saw it later on televised delay a week later. And really, that was a fight that Ali had his jaw broken by Norton. And also, then in September, I attended the fight, and it was at the Fabulous Forum. At the time, the scaling for the tickets was 150, 25, and 12, and I 12.50, and I thought I was going to go in there. I thought, all right, I'll sit upstairs. I'll buy not a $12.50, but a $25 ticket, which for me was a hell of a lot of money in 1973. And I saw that fight live, but I didn't really see it until the televised the televised version of it, that you could see things on television that you couldn't before. But anyway, as it relates to Jerry, really, it was all about Ali. At least, some people don't think he won the rematch. In fact, the great columnist Jim Murray of the LA Times said, and I'm paraphrasing, but this is pretty close. He said, if Ali won that second fight, then Japan won World War II. And that was Murray's style. But anyway, by winning, quote unquote, winning that fight, he certainly did better the first fight than the second fight. The second fight than the first fight, he got his jaw broken, and Norton was really all over him in that first fight, particularly toward the end. And whereas Ali did a lot of damage in the second fight. So by winning that, really, he set himself up for what would be known as the Rumble in the Jungle in 1974.
Well, getting back to Jerry and following that Ernie Shavers fight, he really only had one more big bout, and that was against Frazier a second time. And Joe stopped Jerry in the fifth round. And, that was really it for his big fights. At this point, no one knew how much damage Quarry had sustained over the years from the constant blows to the head. Again, I'm not the greatest in pronunciation, so talk to me about dementia pugilistica, as you've discussed before, and why it takes so long to reveal itself.
Well, it's the nature of the illness. It's progressive. It just keeps getting worse and worse and worse, and the brain shrinks throughout this time. The brain is literally shriveling away, and of course, as that happens, the person loses control of emotions and intellect. And although Bobby Quarry, the younger brother, who had a relatively brief amateur career, sustained some damage, but unlike his brothers, he didn't have nearly as many fights, particularly as an amateur. And he said the jury was okay, or he seemed okay, until his early 40s, whereas Mike Quarry, much earlier than that, was showing signs of dementia pugilistica. Mm-hmm. But let's remember, Jerry died in 1999 at age 53.
Very young.
Yeah, very young.
So he loses to Frazier. He steps out of the ring for a couple of years, and he becomes an actor, a commentator. And he comes back 2 years after the fight to fight again against Lorenzo Zanon.
Lorenzo Zanon, who was an Italian.
Right, and he beat him. But then he retired again, and he comes back 6 years later. And at this point, Sports Illustrated does an article based on research and examinations of Jerry Quarry, and it is determined that he has dementia pugilistica. But Quarry wants to fight, and he finds a state to give him a license, Colorado. He steps into the ring at the age of 47 for now a cruiserweight bout against Ron Kramer, and Jerry serves as a human punching bag for 6 rounds before the fight is stopped. How brutal was that beating?
Well, it was so brutal that Jerry, because of his condition before he even entered the ring, did not know the next day that he'd even been in a fight. And I'm looking at the record of this Ron Kramer or Cranmer right now, and his record was 3-4, 3 wins, 4 losses, and 1 draw. Now that's the kind of guy that Jerry Quarry would never have been fighting under normal circumstances. But when a guy is suffering from pugilistica dementia and is 47 years old and hasn't been fighting in years, he's going to do some things that he wouldn't ordinarily do. But that's, other than Jerry in his very early career, he would not have even bothered fighting that guy. Mm-hmm. He was taking on really excellent fighters, not only the all-time great kind of guys, but just really good fighters. Mm-hmm. And so it was a sad ending. And at that stage, we know now that Jerry just had 7 years to live.
Right. So you write the book. It's called Death in the Ring. A lot of it, is fictional. But the title is very interesting. For Jerry Quarry, who was never the same after that fight, do you think it's fair to say he was basically killed in the ring that day when you consider all that happened afterwards? He couldn't feed himself. He couldn't dress himself. He had to be cared for by relatives. Sure, there was a lot that happened in those years leading up to that fight. But from everything that I read, what Kramer did was it was brutal. The pounding, the beating that Quarry took that day was brutal.
Yes, it was. But I don't think at all that it was that fight alone or primarily that caused Jerry to have dementia pugilistica. As I mentioned, his youngest brother, Bobby Quarry, said that he had started showing signs in his early 40s, and this was just 7 years before his death. So this would put him at around age 46, right? So he was already showing signs of dementia pugilistica, and then it gets back to starting out as a child, trading those headshots with his brothers and others, having a very extensive amateur career, almost 200 fights, and then all these wars as a pro. And remember, it's not only the fights, it's the training and as well. The brain doesn't care whether it's training or whether it's on closed circuit TV or the Madison Square Garden is sold out. So I think Jerry had been taking headshots by that time at age 46. He'd been taking literally for more than 40 years. And it was so I think we can look at that fight as a very sad evening, sad especially and tragic for Jerry and his family, but also it's sad for boxing because that is a fight that absolutely never should have been made. Never. He was absolutely in no condition, not neurologically or athletically. He was in no condition to take that fight, and it's a travesty that anyone, for money or any other reason, would send a man in the ring in that condition.
And that's basically what Sports Illustrated said too. Yeah. And Jerry during that period, actually it was before. In the 80s, was told by Sports Illustrated, they gave him some cognitive tests, and they assessed all too accurately. They said, Jerry, you and Bobby Chacon, another ill-fated warrior, a great fighter, but they said, you guys have dementia pugilistica, which is basically just giving someone a death sentence and saying your brain is going to shrink, you're going to lose control of your not only your mind, but your other organs, and you're going to lose control of your personality, and you're going to be an invalid, and you're going to die young. And that's what, but anyway, I don't think we can blame that last fight, horrible though it was, for Jerry's premature demise. It just punctuated it, but it didn't, or put the exclamation point. It was the straw that broke the camel's back, as they say. Yeah. It was just at that point, it was just ridiculous. But Jerry, I've heard the story. I read the story. I never asked his brother this particular story, but I think it's a valid story. I've read it more than once. That sometimes he would have people over to his house. He was a social guy, and he was married and divorced 3 times. But he would have people over his house for boxing matches to watch, just a social evening. And then he'd say, "Okay, I'm going home now," and everyone would just get really quiet. And then someone would say, "Well, Jerry, this is your house," and he'd laugh and say, "Oh, I know that." So really, even when he was totally in the throes of dementia, he was actually quite funny. The guy who was interviewing him, and again, this would be available on YouTube, was giving Jerry questions to test him. And he says, "What's your mother's first name, Jerry?" And he couldn't answer the question, but his one-liner was great. He says, "I don't know, Mom. What's your first name?" And it was actually quite funny. And so he was a witty guy. And to see any mind destroyed, I think, is a sad thing. Would you consider his career, or do people consider his career a success or a disappointment? Well, from an athletic point of view, it was a success. He won the fights almost without exception that he could have won. I don't think any rational person is going to hold it against him that he lost twice to Ali, twice to Frazier, once to Norton. They were just had too much firepower. True big point. But he won far more than he lost. Sure, he was 53-9-4. 53 wins. 53-9-4. 9 losses, right, and 4 draws.
6 fights by KO. But all of his, I'm just going to read 8 of the 9 losses, and just starting with the most recent, which was Norton. I mean, I'm not even going to count that one with Cranmer. I don't even count that at the end. Kenny Norton, Joe Frazier, Muhammad Ali, George Chuvalo, Joe Frazier, Jimmy Ellis, Eddie Machen. Eddie Machen was a first-rate fighter. And so out of those guys, Ellis held the title, Frazier, Ali, Frazier, Norton. So 6 out of the 9 losses were to guys who held the heavyweight championship at one time or other. So 6 out of his 9 losses, and then to this Cranmer fellow when he had no business in the ring in the first place. And then the other two excellent fighters, Eddie Machen and George Chuvalo. So yeah, Jerry Quarry was one hell of a fighter. There's no doubt about that. So he was successful athletically, but as a fan, maybe an aging fan who's not tough enough anymore, but I just think that the price is too high.
Do you think there was a period of time in boxing where Jerry Quarry might have had a better shot at winning the World Heavyweight Championship? I mean, like you said, the guys he faced were the best.
Yeah, well, in the after Joe Louis, that's a good question, and I've thought about it. And yeah, it's after Joe Louis retired, they had some great fighters, and I'm not saying Jerry could have beaten them, but they were about Jerry's size. In other words, they were under 200 pounds for the most part. Jersey Joe Walcott, who maybe was around 200, but Ezra Charles, those are guys that he would have been very competitive with. And those were guys who won the heavyweight championship after Joe Louis. And I think Marciano, I certainly, Marciano was 10 pounds lighter than Jerry.
Wow.
So,
and he never lost.
No, he never lost, but he never really fought. I mean, he fought Joe Louis at the end of the road, and for Joe. So, I mean, so there's 3 fighters right there that are like Jerry, like Patterson, and again, that's Ezra Charles, Jersey Joe Walcott, and of course the great Marciano. I think most boxing fans would love to see a tournament involving those 3 guys, Quarry, and let's say Patterson, who died of boxing-related Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. So many of these guys, like Ali, had boxing-related Parkinson's. Patterson had boxing-related Alzheimer's. Quarry had dementia pugilistica. And if you just think of fighters here and there and say, I wonder whatever happened to so-and-so if he's dropped off the radar. And you look it up, what you see so often is these guys dying in their 40s and their 50s.
Yeah.
It's just, maybe 60s. Some of them, you can say, well, some of them are going to make it to 80, but really they just die soon. And I'm not saying anything ridiculous like boxing should be illegal. I'm just saying we have to be honest about the price these guys are paying.
Yeah, it's sad. Before Jerry passed, he was there. He was lucky. He was inducted into the World Boxing Hall of Fame. But in the video of his induction ceremony, you could sort of see that he barely knew what was going on.
Yeah, I mean, that's in Jerry's, final 10 to 15 years. That is among the saddest pieces of footage that we have. Other than, to me, the absolute worst was going way back from there, was against Norton, when Norton just really annihilated him. Yeah, Jerry literally did not know where he was. In fact, that's, if you think about that film, the guy who was taking care of him, that was his oldest brother, Jimmy, who the rest of the family felt was taking advantage of Jerry's fame and all that. I don't know. That's a family matter. But he was taking care of Jerry, and Jerry didn't really know where he was. That's right. So he's being inducted into the greatest organization that you can be inducted into as a boxer, the Hall of Fame, International Boxing Hall of Fame. But he just didn't know where he was.
You know, Tom, as you were talking just before about boxers who fall off the face of the earth, and you go and you look them up and you find out they have passed on or they're struggling with some sort of disease brought on by the constant battle in the ring and all the head blows. I'm sitting here and thinking about how brutal some of the UFC fights are, and yet we don't hear about any of them dealing with any of these issues. And I'm just wondering, is that because boxing was that much more brutal, or is it because perhaps UFC is still such a young sport?
Well, I think both reasons are correct. Boxing has been around on a very sophisticated professional level for 150 years, I would say. And of course, people have been boxing for a long, long time, even before that. So we have, if you look at MMA, mixed martial arts, 150 years from now, I think you'll see some cases like that, like the fellows we've talked about in boxing. And there is another factor, though. Even though a mixed martial artist is very happy to hit or kick an opponent in the head, there are, in fact, many different ways to attack your opponent and to defeat your opponent in mixed martial arts. There are takedowns, and there are arm bars. You can get people to submit on the arm or the leg or the chokeholds. There are a lot of chokeholds that really don't leave any lasting injuries for the most part. Mm-hmm. So I'm not saying we'll never see any fatalities and we'll never see any cases of dementia pugilistica in MMA, but I don't think we're going to see nearly as many because the guys are formidable strikers, but they're not strikers in the same league with boxers in terms of stand-up fighting. A mixed martial artist would go in if say you put a mixed martial artist against a boxer, mixed martial artists would go in there, in most cases, go underneath the punches and just take the fighter down. And we've seen that. Randy Couture, veteran champion who was retired, fought James Toney about 10 years ago and took him down very rapidly. And Toney was a great multiple champion, everything from middleweight to heavyweight. But anyway, I think you're right. Both the lack of historical evidence with MMA and the fact that these guys are not hitting each other constantly, they're grappling, submitting each other. Whereas in boxing, even though there are body shots, essentially they're targeting heads. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, Tom, I want to thank you once again for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes. Our discussion today about Jerry Quarry, certainly fascinating. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. I enjoyed it, as I always do.
Awesome. Thanks. The beatings, punishment, and constant blows to the head were just too much for anyone to endure. And despite the pleas of many, Jerry Quarry didn't listen. He was a boxer, a fighter, and that's what he wanted to do. That last fight against Ron Cranmer was a sad, sad end to what was really a terrific career. Still, the punishment of 18 years in the ring was just too much, and Quarry's bout with pugilistica dementia was way too much for him to overcome. Those last few years of his life were tough on everyone. The fact that he really couldn't enjoy his induction into the Boxing Hall of Fame was truly a sad moment. But his life prior was a thrill. He was able to step into the ring and, for the most part, hold his own against some of boxing's greatest names, Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. Jerry Quarry was a boxer, and that's what he did. box. Once again, I'd like to thank my guest, Tom Clark, for stopping by. If you'd like to hear more of Tom and his thoughts on boxing, get his book, Death in the Ring, or check out episode 6 of Sports Forgotten Heroes about Teofilo Stevenson, or episode 42 about Archie Moore, both with Tom. Next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes, we're going to talk about one of the greatest defensemen to ever play in the NHL, but a guy so few knew much about, Pierre Palat. That's next time. For now, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday's Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.